How else are they conducting this war against us?
Well, the idea of the OmniWar is that it's a war which is being waged across every domain of human life, but by stealth as far as possible, so that the public doesn't notice. Because if the public gets wise to this, again, the whole thing fails. So it has to be waged through deception. So I published a long report for Solari last autumn called OmniWar, Exposing and Ending the Invisible War Against Humanity. It's available for my Substack paid subscribers. And in that, I lay out all of the different elements of the OmniWar. But as the name suggests, it's everywhere. It's all around us. It's in the media that we consume. It goes kind of from the cell to the stratosphere, to use one of our strap lines. So kind of biological engineering, so-called vaccines, all the way up to whatever is happening in the skies. It works through financial manipulations. It works through propaganda and psychological warfare. Pretty much everywhere you look, you can find this. And its purpose is to keep the population down, to keep the population in check, to keep the population passive and compliant, while liberal democracy is gradually dismantled and the new technocratic control system is instituted. And so when you think back to COVID, the extreme stress levels that were created, the psychological and physical damage that was caused, and then of course all of the vaccine damage as well, plus the fact that the whole thing was traumatic, and people, were almost living in populations that are characterized by PTSD at some basic level as a result of all of that. This is literally war against the population. I think it's a silent, undeclared World War III, because what they're trying to do is to achieve social engineering at the global scale. And that's only been done before through World War. If you want to achieve that level, that scale of change, it does require World War. But of course, this World War looks nothing like the Second World War. The Second World War really looked nothing like the First World War. The aims and the strategies, the tactics, the participants, the methods, the weapons, pretty much all different. But nevertheless, it fundamentally is a war. It has a clearly defined objective in terms of global technocracy. And how will you achieve that? How will you stop global revolution, actually, while trying to achieve change on that audacious scale? You have to resort to every single means at your disposal and weaponize everything.
I think when I heard 9/11, I mean, obviously it was bothering that some planes flew into some towers and killed some people, but it didn't affect my brain circuitry. But it works, does it? What's
It
the
does.
mechanism?
Well, there are many mechanisms. Some of the mechanisms are extremely crude. You shock people, you put them into that state, and then it's just wall-to-wall propaganda. I mean, anyone old enough to remember, it's nothing but terrorism, 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 terrorism in the news, for years after 9/11. And that's enough, actually, to work on most ordinary members of the public. It's just the power of propaganda in that case. What was scary about COVID, and what I argue in my book, is that it wasn't really a public health crisis. It was a psychological warfare operation deployed against the public. What's scary about it is it worked on multiple different levels, involving all kinds of psychological techniques which have been developed over the course of the 20th century and beyond, and rolled out simultaneously, all at once, against the publics of countries transnationally. So this is what we are faced with now. I call it a transnational deep state, which is waging what I call an omni-war against the rest of humanity in an attempt to preserve the ruling class rule.
How have these high-tier administrators have been persuaded that what they're doing makes sense? and is in their interests.
Yeah, it's difficult to know, isn't it? The extent to which certain figures have been bribed, blackmailed, bullied, potentially rewarded, promise of rewards. The mechanisms are complex. I mean, a lot has come out since 2020 about the really dark nature of the power structures that are operating. When we're looking at paedophilia and so on, it seems to be a kind of inherent part of the closer you get to the top, and that can be used to extort people. Essentially what we're dealing with is a criminal cartel on a global level, and it will go to any lengths. Indeed, it has to go to all lengths in order to achieve its objective, and that, I think, necessarily requires a psychopathic mindset, which at some fundamental level is empathy deleted, to be able to do this to people. And they get away with it in large measure by hiding in the shadows. But yes, in terms of that kind of tier, it's like layers of the class system almost, that historically the middle classes and upper middle classes have thrown in their lot with the upper class, because they know that that'll tend to benefit them, and meanwhile it's the majority working class that will lose out. What's interesting really since the 2008 financial crisis has been what some critics have called the de-bourgeoisification of the West, that the middle class is also shrinking and also getting worse off as this kind of super rich end of the spectrum creams off more and more wealth. So we're looking at an increasingly skewed and disproportionate ownership and control over the world's wealth, in the sense that you're not allowed to question this. And then you have the law courts, in fact the High Court of Justice, so-called, persecuting Richard D. Hall for his real investigative journalism into this. The disturbing element, therefore, is that we are looking at a coordinated kind of statewide operation here to make sure that this narrative does not fall and is not unpicked. This is terrible because it means even 3 years before COVID, you can see that fundamentally the power structure is deployed against the people. So there is no social contract in any meaningful sense. And as I argue in my COVID book, I think that the transnational deep state, the entity that really is this power structure, is now quite literally at war with the people in very clever, hidden, nefarious ways. So we can't say that we live in liberal democracy in any meaningful sense when all of this is going on. What you have are various elements of the state which I think have been infiltrated, by rogue networks. It's, certainly not everyone who works in these organizations, but they are certainly conspiring together to manufacture events like this, which are then used as the pretext to roll out ever more draconian and repressive measures at home, as well as legitimizing foreign interventions and wars abroad. If the public understands that that's really what is taking place, that it's being lied to in order to further its oppression, actually the implications are revolutionary, because the entire social contract has been torn up. Not by us, not by the people, but by the authorities. We are living in historically precarious times, and that's why they're going to such desperate lengths to secure narratives like the Manchester narrative, and are so desperate to stop this awareness from spreading, because I think if enough people understood, there would be revolution overnight.
I thought that the banging the pots and pans for the NHS was a particularly egregious trick they played on us.
That is what applied behavioural psychology, as in the Mindspace document of 2010, calls signalling commitment. And the idea behind this is it's kind of like a foot in the door thing. Seems like a small, innocuous gesture, but once you have banged your pots and pans in public, and it's the public part that's important, and your neighbours have seen you doing this, you have publicly declared that you are on board with the narrative. Once you have done so in public view, it's psychologically very difficult to go back on that. So that's just a very small thing to start with. And of course, it then gradually builds and builds and builds, and the public is expected to buy into it in more and more and more ways. So, yep, quite primitive, quite simple, but also effective in achieving compliance.
The Conference of the United Nations on International Organization is now convened.
The United States and the Soviet Union are now among the chief artisans of the new international order.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
Memorandum, dated 19th of June, 1964. Subject, Soviet research and development in the field of direction and control of human behavior. Current research indicates that the Soviets are attempting to develop a technology for controlling the development of behavioral patterns among the citizenry of the USSR in accordance with politically determined requirements of the system.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
Shortly before his assassination, JFK had been warning about a system operating from the shadows.
And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control.
Repeating, President Kennedy has been shot by a would-be assassin in Dallas, Texas. Stay tuned to CBS News for further details.
It takes more than an instant to make a real cup of coffee.
Furthermore, the same technology can be applied to more sophisticated approaches to the coding of information for transmittal to the population targets in the battle for the minds of men.
Studying how to manipulate society.
Yeah, and, of course, Pavlov around the similar period of time, in early 20th century, mechanisms of conditioning the human mind, or fast forward to 1943 and Winston Churchill. And he said, the empires of the future will be the empires of the mind. And so rather than controlling populations through the threat of physical violence and so on, essentially mind control of various forms is the way forward. And that's really what we saw post 1945 in all kinds of ways, psychological operations and propaganda and so on. And the scary thing in the 21st century is that, I think, as I've argued in a recent symposium that I and some colleagues did on the brain, that might now be becoming even more advanced, that they're looking to directly manipulate the brain neurologically, not just psychologically. So it's pretty frightening, actually, the kinds of techniques and powers that we're up against.
This fantastic phrase came up. You describe a phenomenon called permanent social turbulence, which I think explains so much. Where does that one come from?
Comes from the Tavistock Institute in the 1960s. Yeah, no surprise, eh? And it's all to do with techniques of shock and stress and keeping entire societies in states which render them more susceptible to propaganda and thereby more controllable. So, I mean, it all goes back originally to World War I and shell shock, and the realization that individuals with shell shock were more psychologically susceptible and programmable, essentially. And of course, in the mid 20th century, then had MK Ultra, which was just kind of upping the ante in terms of the brutality of experiments on individuals. But what's significant about the second half of the 20th century, particularly with the Tavistock Institute, is attempts to apply similar techniques at the group and also the societal levels. And they did a lot of work on this. Students to investigate the science of mask wearing, not trying to persuade them of anything, just saying, look into it yourself. Or Harvey Risch at Yale for recommending hydroxychloroquine. His own colleagues, again, wrote an open letter against him, or Scott Atlas at Stanford, another open letter with, a couple of dozen academics each time signing these things. So, this is kind of herd behavior, isn't it? It's kind of group behavior. It's creating a scapegoat. This is the opposite of what academia is supposed to be about. So the warning signs really were well and truly on the walls in 2020. And when you think that people are thinking that way and behaving that way, there's no kind of intellectual independence anymore. They're just given a narrative, they subscribe to the narrative, and they defend it with all that they're worth. This is a troubling reflection, I think, on the state of contemporary academia. One of my best friends from Christchurch, but he went into the law. He became a barrister. He took that very kind of establishment route, and he visited me last year, and I quickly realised that all this time later, despite being such a smart bloke, he just is completely in that normie mindset. He thinks that chemtrails aren't real. He doesn't believe in false flag terrorism, and just about as kind of straight down the road as they come. And I just thought that is quite remarkable, really. And I saw the similar kind of thing in academia. I find it a remarkable sociological phenomenon that you have this profession which is operating worldwide, and goodness knows how many academics there are in academia. So why is it that virtually none are asking the critical questions? And you see that through professionalization, institutionalization, socialization, smart people learn how not to ask the questions, how not to go down the rabbit holes. And that's part of the reason that we're in the problem, in the state that we're in now, where many of those who do are kind of ridiculed through the propaganda term conspiracy theorist and so on, when in actual fact there's some very serious questions to be asked, mountains of evidence to be looking at, and it's really the moral responsibility of intellectuals to be doing this kind of work. This is the whole idea of the public intellectual as it emerged in the 20th century, speaking truth to power. There's a civic duty here, and when so much of the tyranny in the world today is premised on lies and deception, the first people exposing that should be academics, but they're not doing it.
Yeah, and then we get these people presented to us as intellectuals, the so-called intellectual dark web, where you get these fake guru heroes being presented to us, like Jordan Peterson.
I was going to mention him.
They've got every base covered, haven't they? And that's the thing. These people, whoever they are, who run the world.
Yeah, they really do. It's quite frightening, and that kind of mainstream alternative media personality type there is very powerful. And I think that actually the so-called alternative media is riddled with people like this. It makes it so hard to get to the truth. In my work, I sometimes offer a simple three camp analogy, as I call it. Camp one is basically the normies. They believe everything here on the TV and what the government says. Camp two is for the people who have doubts about the official version of events. They get into camp two and they're met by people like Peterson and Brand and others, whose role is the kind of Pied Piper role to lead them away from truth and distract from some of the key things, while nevertheless giving certain nuggets, but the really big issues not acting honestly on. Camp three is the truth. It's a lonely and it's an ugly place to be. And what I've come to realise over the last 12 months or so is that Camp 3 is actually very small compared to Camp 2. So many people get out of Camp 1 and think that they've kind of made it towards the truth, but actually there's an awful long way still to go. We're so systematic, so progressive, so carefully coordinated transnationally. First attacks through the media, then attacks through politicians. This was clearly all by design. The whole thing had been planned down to a very minute level of detail. So I think that all of this has been in the works for a very, very long time.
Explain the why Kill Granny was so effective.
Because it goes back to MK Ultra. And one of the things about MK Ultra, first of all, it was often used on children, because it's believed that, the younger you are, the more programmable you are. And one of the aspects of trauma-based mind control is either killing somebody else, or seeing somebody else killed in front of you, or believing that you've killed someone else, or believing that you've seen someone killed in front of you, even when that's not the case. So if you take that logic that, these things put people in considerable states of trauma, and you then tell young people, as the media did, as politicians did, and as certain academics did, that if you go home for Christmas in 2020 and you have a positive test result using a meaningless test, and your grandmother happens to die around that time, you're responsible. Yeah, this is traumatizing stuff. I actually had one student to whom this happened. Went back for the Christmas break, tested positive, granny died. She thought she killed a granny. This is dark.
What's it called when we become sort of post-human and all
transhumanism.
And when this stuff is inserted into our systems and we become, well, tell me about that.
Well, it's a huge topic. What we do know, before we get onto that, is that the first couple of decades of the 21st century have seen the rise of what's called network-centric warfare. So essentially it's internet enabled. All different elements of the US DoD are placed on a grid. They call it the global information grid. It's all networked. The idea is that information creates greater speed, greater, improved response times, greater efficiencies, and so on. Drone warfare is a good example of this. You don't need massive, great military vehicles necessarily to achieve your objective, when you can use it in a much more precise and targeted way through kind of smaller things like drones. This is all known, and incidentally, those networks are increasingly being powered by AI. Now, the frightening suggestion then becomes, what happens when the nodes on the control grids are no longer pieces of military equipment, no longer computers, but human bodies? So if everybody becomes trackable and traceable on the network through intracorporeal nanotechnologies, we have a real problem, because there's no privacy, there's no escape, there's no hiding. Dissidents could, in theory, be targeted if there is some kind of interconnection between EMF frequencies of whatever kind and whatever's in the body. So, it could be used to cause pain, it could be used to cause torture, it could be used for assassination potentially. Now, that the targeted individuals community, for example, say this kind of thing is already going on. But what's really troubling is the extensive literature on what's called the Internet of Bio-Nano Things since 2015. We know for a fact that this has been in development for a long time. You can even trace the ideas right back to a 2001 NASA document, in fact. There's huge amounts of funding being thrown at it. The intent is clearly there to create what NASA's chief scientist in 2001 called the IT bio-nano era. And what that really means is connecting human bodies, bio, via nanotechnology, to IT, making us part of the network. This has been the overarching plan for the whole of the 21st century. So it would have sounded crazy back then, but not anymore. And of course, smart technologies become ever more ubiquitous. The idea is to connect everything with everything. The truth is what it is. Objective reality is what it is. The question is, will enough people awaken to it in time before this technocratic system, which is coming down the tracks hard now, is successfully rolled out? I don't have a crystal ball. I couldn't give you the answer, but what I do know is that there are very, very bad people in the world who are seeking to replace liberal democracy with a novel form of totalitarianism, which is technocracy. In its worst instantiation, it could be biodigital. We could all be connected, our bodies could be connected to the control grid. This is horrific, what they have planned for us. There's plenty of evidence to support all of this. If enough people see it, it can be stopped. Mass non-compliance is the way forward. And it's in the interests, the objective interests of humanity to see it. Now, I've spoken in previous interviews about how fundamentally this is a battle between good and evil. And I was, in 2020, I felt as though I was looking straight into the face of evil. It was an awful experience. And, when I'm looking at, I don't know, the images of children being forced to wear masks all day long, attempts to coerce people to take experimental substances into their body, the lockdowns, which the World Economic Forum described as the world's largest ever psychological experiment, and could just see, all of society just being treated like guinea pigs on so many different levels, with absolute contempt, all of the psychological abuse through the techniques that we've discussed, all of this going on at once in 2020, the threat to human freedom and everything else. And I was really struck really powerfully, more than any other time in my life, by the sense of I am just faced with raw evil at this point. And so, there's clearly a religious dimension in this. I don't know how you could look at these things and find any legitimacy in them. They are just bad.
That we should be planning for the flourishing of as many people as possible, that human agency ought to be respected, that civil liberties ought to be respected, and that the imposition of top-down, one-size-fits-all policies on humanity is completely incompatible with that kind of worldview. Set up against them are people who regard humans as the scum on the surface of the little blue dot, people who regard humanity as some kind of blight, people who believe that the earth needs rights to protect it from these horrible humans. And I think it is a deeply sad reflection of the state of our societies that so many people live in the latter camp, but I'm definitely not one of them.
We can all stand up to tyranny. We can and must fight for the things that truly matter. The people we love, the fairness we'd like to see, and the personal freedoms we'd like to experience. We should not be bullied, nor should we accept the influences of those who would split our society, be it by race, by gender, by culture, or anything else we hold dear. And perhaps we should start by limiting our reliance on technology and remembering how creative we can be.
Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. You can't go backwards. So what that means is that over time, more and more people are starting to see this now. The powers that be have no choice but to keep pushing forward for their global technocracy. They're the ones who are attempting the controlled demolition of liberal democracy. They have only one route they can go, and they are tobogganing towards disaster. On the other side, we the people have no choice but to fight back against all of this.
I don't expect that we're going to just be able to tell the truth indefinitely without consequences, but we must continue to do it. We must, for the sake of our children, for the sake of humanity, for the sake of generations yet unborn. We have no option but to stand against this evil.
if you look at where this thing is going, I'm not going there, okay? And whether God takes me out or the leadership takes me out, I don't care. I'm not going there. And the only way we cannot go there is if we can find a better pathway. And the only way we're going to find a better pathway is with transparency.
If I want to live as a virtuous human being, I need to live amongst people that are free. And if one understands that one mustn't live on their knees, even if you have to die on your feet, you must share truth, because truth is the weapon for free people.